area is Myron Robinson, who ran the Urban League in Cleveland. And a good friend, not urban leaguer, but a good friend in that area, in your area, is George Miles. We work together at Channel 13. George, as I'm sure you know, is responsible almost single-handedly for the revival of doo-wop music on public television. So he's got an illustrious history. I want to salute the association for all of your work and the fact that you've got a thriving chapter in the Sarasota area. As we know, your work has never been more important. Let me speak to you briefly about my ancestry. My mother, Charlotte Price, and her sister, Violet Royster, were bloodhounds when it came to tracking down our family ancestry. When my mother was in her mid to late 50s, she transitioned from being an activist to an archivist, and she obtained a master's degree in library sciences at the age of 58. She was a protege and dear friend of Dorothy Porter, who built the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University into one of the world's best collections of library materials about Black and Africana history and culture. My mother moved from Washington, D.C. to Plymouth, Massachusetts after my father's death in 1973. She became an activist at Pilgrim Hall, which was the historic society there, and she handled Miles Standish's paper, big difference in there. And in 1976, she was appointed acting executive director of Pilgrim Hall, and she may have been the first African-American director of a so-called mainstream historical society in this country. And the exhibition called Remember the Ladies, about the first ladies of the United States, premiered at Pilgrim Hall on her watch. When I was growing up, my mother always talked about the interesting and notable ancestors in our history. Let me tell you about a couple of them. Robert Gunnell was my great-great-great-grandfather on my father's side. He was a slave who purchased his freedom in the mid-1830s. He then purchased his family, his children and his wife, presumably to prevent white slave owners from buying and stealing them. This was rare but not unprecedented, that there were Black slave owners for beneficent reasons. He owned a home on Old Georgetown Pike in McLean, Virginia, a short walk from what is now the CIA. When Congress emancipated the slaves in Washington, D.C. in 1862, Robert Gunnell was paid just over $2,000 as compensation for the liberation of his property. Then there's Nero Hawley, who was my great-great-great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. He was a slave who lived in Trumbull, Connecticut, and he earned his freedom by fighting in the American Revolution. He served at Valley Forge under the command of General George Washington. Nero was paid for his service with a treasury note, which he signed by an X in 1782. And it is my praise and blessing that I owned that treasury note. I can't begin to tell you what it was like to receive delivery of it. In 2002, the Daughters of the American Revolution staged an exhibition called Forgotten Patriots, African American and American Indian Service in the Revolutionary War. And it featured a display about Nero, including the treasury note, which I had loaned to them. And I wrote an article about visiting the house where he lived in Trumbull, Connecticut, which appeared in American Legacy magazine. And visiting it was like touring a museum. And it may actually have been haunted because there are stories about the ghost of Nero Hawley. And if you're curious, we can talk about it during the Q&A. Now, when my mother talked to me about my ancestors, my reaction was that of a typical kid. Let's talk later. I got to go play baseball. My priorities when I was young were school, homework, sports, and when the adolescent hormones kicked in, girls, but not necessarily in that order. Which brings us to the Latimers. In college, I dated a lovely co-ed who lived in Brooklyn, and I used to drive up from DC to New York to see her in the summers. My mother arranged for me to stay with Aunt Louise Latimer, who was Louis Latimer's daughter. She lived in the family house, his house in Flushing, Queens. And that's now the site of the Louis Latimer House Museum on another location in Queens. Aunt Louise would put me up in his master bedroom, and I probably slept in what had been his bed. She always told me to come to breakfast so she could tell me all about my historically important ancestors, Louis and his father, George. Now, you will cringe when I confess that I told Aunt Louise, thanks, but another time. Right now, I got to go to Brooklyn. You understand, don't you? I got to go to Brooklyn. So please give me the directions to the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. In retrospect, I was a knucklehead because I missed an opportunity to learn all about and perhaps see photos of my important great-granduncle Louis, his sister Margaret, who was my great-grandmother, and their parents, George and Rebecca Latimer, the famous fugitive slaves. The lesson for me is that we need to encourage our children and grandchildren to learn about our ancestors, but it doesn't matter whether they're famous. History is told from a 40,000 foot altitude looking down, but it's equally important to tell history from the ground up through the eyes and lives of everyday people. And just witness the power of Isabel Wilkerson's powerful Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And with the bogus claims that white people alone built America and the assaults on teaching school children the truth about race and racism in our country, it's more important than ever for organizations like yours to do the work that you do. So who is Louis Latimer? In 1880, the fabled inventor Thomas Edison secured the first patent for an incandescent light bulb in the United States. Yet his original creation burned out quickly and thus wasn't practical. In a game-changing advance for electric lighting, 2 years later, Louis Latimer, the son of fugitive slaves, invented a carbon filament which made light bulbs more durable and longer lasting, more energy efficient and affordable for everyday use by ordinary people. Latimer initially garnered scant public recognition for his huge contribution, in part because his employer, Hiram Maxim, routinely claimed credit for his employees' inventions. Louis Latimer remains inexplicably and inexcusably overlooked and unappreciated to this day. There was no mention of him in a major documentary about Edison several years ago on PBS, and the same is true for a recent definitive biography of Edison. These glaring omissions discredit and indeed obliterate Latimer's legacy by doing him unworthy of inclusion in the history of this country. Distressingly few Black people, and especially young people today, know of and take justifiable pride in Louis Latimer's pioneering accomplishments. And Americans writ large have little knowledge that a Black man helped build our country by helping to lay the technological foundation for modernity. Now, Louis Latimer's journey to greatness actually began before he was born. In 1842, his parents, George and Rebecca Latimer, both slaves, escaped from Norfolk, Virginia by sneaking onto a steamer and hiding below deck in the hold for 9 hours. And let me pause and just ask Marion to post the photograph of George Latimer, my maternal great-great-grandfather, the famous fugitive slave, and the father of Louis Latimer and Margaret Latimer Hawley. Rebecca was pregnant with Margaret, my great-grandmother, when the vessel reached Baltimore, was pregnant when they left. When the vessel reached Baltimore, they came out of hiding and continued north. As the light-skinned George later recounted, quote, "From Baltimore to Philadelphia, I traveled as a gentleman with my wife as a servant. After that, it presumably being a free country, we traveled as man and wife." 4 days after arriving in Boston, George was spotted by a former employee of his slave owner. The owner initiated legal proceedings to force his return to Virginia. Now, noted abolitionists like the legendary Frederick Douglass and the renowned abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison rallied publicly to his side. And in fact, this was the first high-profile national case for the young Frederick Douglass. The historian Asa Davis maintained that George Latimer was the first fugitive slave whose emancipation guided and influenced the American abolitionists in the 1840s. Much of the drama of his liberation played out at Faneuil Hall in Boston. George Latimer finally gained his freedom after tense negotiations. The episode solidified his status as a celebrity, and it helped fuel a successful drive by abolitionists to secure passage of a Massachusetts law prohibiting public officials from aiding in the recapture of fugitive slaves. In addition, John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a famous poem about the George Latimer case titled "From Massachusetts to Virginia." George and Rebecca had 4 children. The oldest was Margaret. And Marion, if you would put up the photograph of Marion Latimer Hawley, please. Marion was my maternal great-grandmother, the older sister of Lewis, and Rebecca was pregnant with Marion when she and her husband George escaped. Please also put up the photograph next of Augustus Hawley. Marion was married to Augustus Hawley, who was my maternal great-grandfather. He was married, Margaret was married to my great-grandfather, Augustus Hawley. He was the great-grandson of Nero Hawley, the slave who earned his freedom by fighting in the American Revolution. Lewis was the youngest of the 4 Latimer children, born 6 years later in 1848. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the notorious Dred Scott case that slaves were not considered free even if they lived in a free state. George Latimer soon abandoned his family for reasons which remain a mystery, although he may have wanted to shield his family from the risk of his recapture. In any event, this left Rebecca to fend for the family. Lewis Latimer worked odd jobs as a youngster to help support his family, and he actually never progressed beyond grade school. To earn money, Rebecca eventually went out to sea as a stewardess, and Lewis was sent to join his brother in a state institution called the Farm School, which was akin to an orphanage. They escaped, hiding out in railroad cars, and rejoined their mother. In 1864, Lewis fibbed about his age and enlisted in the Navy. He received a dishonorable discharge when the Civil War ended and sought work in Boston. He initially secured a menial job as an office boy in the patent law firm of Crosby and Gould. Now, even though he'd never progressed beyond grade school, the enterprising and ambitious Lewis taught himself mechanical drawing through research, practice, and the powers of observation. He demonstrated these skills at the firm and actually won promotion from office boy to chief draftsman. By sheer force of will, vision, and preparation, he became a consequential player in the stunning technological revolution at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. At the law firm, he mastered the processes and intricacies of winning patents. Alexander Graham Bell engaged Lewis to prepare the technical drawings and thus perfect his patent application for the telephone so that it could be filed first, barely a few hours before a rival inventor. Lewis Latimer's most enduring accomplishment and primary claim to fame stemmed from his prowess as an inventor. In 1879, he began working as a mechanical draftsman for Hiram Maxim, the inventor who was with the U.S. Electrical Lighting Company in Bridgeport. Early the following year, Latimer moved to there in 1879, Bridgeport. Early the following year, Edison received a U.S. patent for the first electric light bulb. But as I said, the problem was that the filament burned out very quickly. Many inventors set about trying to find a solution, and the ingenious Lewis Latimer was among them. While working for Maxim, Lewis successfully devised a carbon filament which enabled bulbs to burn longer and thus be affordable, energy efficient, and practical for everyday use. Sadly, his game-changing accomplishment was initially obscured because, as I mentioned, Maxim had the legal right to his employees' patents. But in 1882, Latimer secured a carbon filament patent in his own name. And he had other notable patents, including a water closet for railway cars and a precursor to air conditioning. Lewis Latimer's knowledge of arc and incandescent lighting established him as one of the premier authorities in the industry. While working for the U.S. Electric Lighting Company, he helped install and operate some of the first electric plants in major North American cities, namely New York City, Philadelphia, and Montreal. He directed the production and installation of lighting in railroad stations and on streets. He lit such marquee structures in New York City as the Equitable Building and the Union League Club. Maxim also sent him to London to establish its first lamp factory to supply that growing market. Lewis did what he was asked to do in London, but he encountered racism there and soon returned. Let me ask Marion to post the photograph of Lewis Latimer. Thank you. And then if you would, please post the photograph of Cora Hawley with her uncle, Lewis Latimer. Cora Hawley was the daughter of Margaret and Augustus Hawley, and she was my maternal grandmother. I'm sorry if the photo is kind of fuzzy, but it looks a little artistic to me. I couldn't get it any sharper. In 1884, Lewis Latimer officially joined Thomas Edison's team, and he later became such a recognized authority that he served as an expert witness for Edison in patent lawsuits asserting and defending his inventions. As further evidence of his value to major companies, Lewis served from 1896 until 1911 as chief draftsman and patent consultant for the Board of Patent Control, which was a joint venture formed by General Electric and Westinghouse to coordinate patent licensing and litigation. Now, make no mistake, Latimer's career was no cakewalk. Occasionally, his employers went out of business. He lost jobs. The great inventor had to scuffle on occasion by earning a living as a barber and a wallpaper hanger. Yet by 1918, Lewis had garnered such professional acclaim that he became a founding charter member and the only Black member of the celebrated and esteemed Edison Pioneers. Marion, would you put up the photo of Lewis with the Edison Pioneers? In that photo, if you look to the right of Lewis Latimer, you'll see a photo of the picture of Edison in the hat standing behind, and just to the right of the man who is seated. Lewis Latimer was a true Renaissance man. He wrote a book titled Incandescent Electric Lighting, a practical description of the Edison system. His book proved to be so popular that it was recognized as the Bible, if you will, for electrical engineers everywhere. Lewis found beauty and respite in the arts by painting portraits, playing the violin and flute, and writing poetry and plays. Even as he achieved success in mainstream America, he remained resolutely proud of his race and devoted to Black progress. His activist impulses spurred him to correspond with Frederick Douglass, as well as with Booker T. Washington and Richard Theodore Grenier, the first Black graduate of Harvard University who became Dean of Howard University's Law School. And alarmed by overt segregation and lynching of Black people, Lewis Latimer joined in calling for a national convention of Black Americans to strengthen the organized Black vote on behalf of justice and equal rights. And the interesting issue is the extent to which he matters and resonates today. Nearly 175 years after his birth, Lewis Latimer's story is very, very powerful in this day and age for many reasons. For starters, it's a compelling and uplifting African-American story, and indeed an inspiring American story, which everyone can relate to. The son of escaped slaves, his is a Horatio Alger story. He was a bright, ambitious, preternaturally savvy youngster from a broken home who never progressed beyond elementary school. Yet he produced a momentous invention and, his race notwithstanding, achieved success in the mainstream business world. In addition to his notable inventions, Latimer pioneered as a Black man who ran significant business operations for his employers in major cities in this country and internationally, namely in Canada and Great Britain. He climbed up the ranks while quietly shattering glass ceilings in the mainstream business world along the way. And he ascended the ladder of responsibility for core business operations. Lewis Latimer's life speaks to one of the critically important educational equity issues today, because he brings the critical importance of what we call STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, to life. A century and a half ago, Lewis Latimer demonstrated what research affirms today, that competence and mastery of the STEM disciplines help equip young people, including those from traditionally overlooked and excluded populations, for success in these fields in the mainstream economy. Yet children growing up today in predominantly minority and low-income communities routinely miss out on these courses beginning as early as elementary school. And if youngsters do not become curious, confident, and proficient early on, they will struggle to get on the on-ramp to continue STEM coursework in junior high school, college, and beyond. Educators and policymakers must address this crippling deficit in children's education. And Lewis Latimer's relevance to STEM does not end there. He was an early apostle of the modern and closely related school of educational thought called STEAM, namely the addition of the arts to STEM. In a visionary paper which he delivered to the Bridgeport Scientific Society in 1880, he argued that art and science are inextricably linked. It was a revelation to read that according to the Smithsonian Institute's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, his technical drawings were admired as works of art. What's known today as STEAM calls for students to be exposed to the disciplines of science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math. As an inventor whose precise patent drawings were considered works of art, Latimer personified STEAM more than 140 years before the acronym existed. And examples of the art-science interface today include Apple products, user-friendly products, ergonomics, and auto design. The bottom line is that Lewis Latimer was a trailblazer for the traditionally marginalized, minorities, women, and members of the LGBTQ community who have followed in the path he helped clear. He demonstrated that people who traditionally are denied opportunity can compete and excel, produce and perform, and contribute as capably as anyone else. And when you think about it, virtually every minute of every day, every American has a light on somewhere, which is a direct descendant of Lewis Latimer's carbon filament bulb. It's my privilege and pleasure to serve as the vice chair of the board of the Lewis Latimer House Museum. It was his last home and his only home in New York, and it now located on a new site. The museum is equipped with a working laboratory where young people actually invent stuff and display it to their parents. It's also the venue for art exhibitions, readings, and screenings, many of which relate thematically to Lewis Latimer's life and continuing relevance. For example, next month, in honor of International Black Women's History Month, the museum's Illuminating Histories series will celebrate Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American woman to publish a book of poetry. September 4th, 2023 will mark the 175th anniversary of Lewis Latimer's birth, and we plan to mount an ambitious, aggressive, innovative, and multidimensional campaign to propagate his legacy. We're on a mission to show the American people that Lewis Latimer, a Black inventor, helped build America. And in so doing, we aim to make Lewis Latimer at long last a household name, so that whenever Black people, and indeed all people, turn on the switch, we think of Lewis Latimer, and better yet, we thank him for his historic role in bringing light into our lives. And I'll just say that following today, I will welcome opportunity to talk with the leaders of the Manasota chapter about ways in which we might bring his life and legacy and the work of the museum to the attention of the national leadership, the individual chapters, and individual members of your association. Let me close by sharing another inspiring way in which Lewis Latimer's life resonates powerfully today. Latimer, the poet, was an early exponent of Black is Beautiful, a dynamic movement which swept the nation starting in the 1960s and holds sway to this day. Consider this ode which he wrote to his wife, Mary, titled Ebon Venus. Let others boast of maidens fair, of eyes blue and golden hair. My heart, like needle ever true, turns to the maid of ebon hue. I love her form of matchless grace, the dark brown beauty of her face, her lips that speak of love's delight, her eyes that gleam as stars at night. O'er marble Venus let them rage, who set the fashions of the age, each to his taste, but as for me, my Venus shall be ebony. Thank you.
Gary, I know you want to say something, but I have to tell Hugh that you have, my daughter's name is Ebony. You could not have, you could not have ended that brilliant presentation in any more powerful way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Marion, I think there's
thank
some
you.
questions.
I think that Marion has a few questions in the chat that she would like to present to you and give you an opportunity to address.
You want me to also work off the chat, or do you want to just, can Mary, maybe can you just pose them to me?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Has a marker ever been placed on his grave in Fall River, Massachusetts?
That's interesting. He lies next to his wife, who is in an unmarked grave, and Lewis, for reasons we don't fully understand, his grave is not marked. And that's one of the pieces of business for us as part of the commemoration. Rand can tell you more about it, but she's been to the gravesite. It's a mystery because his family was around, so we don't know what happened, but it's the truth. But we're working on it.
Okay. Would it be possible to expand your online STEM offering so that it can be used here in Sarasota?
Let me ask, Rand, can you pop on to answer that question?
Yes, I'm happy to answer the question. We are actually just finished refining our current K-12 curriculum, and we expect to publish them online for free near the early summer, and we would love to bring them to Saratoga and elsewhere in the nation. I'll share our education email with you in the chat.
Excellent.
And another question is, what was your involvement in saving the house from demolition?
That predates both of us. Lewis Latimer's granddaughter, Winifred Norman, was the engine behind that effort to move the house when it was threatened. They hoisted it and moved it, and she teamed up with the borough president of Queens, Claire Schulman, to do that. I think, when was that, ran in the mid-1990s? It was a major production. And then it opened, several years after that, after it underwent renovation, et cetera. But that was Winifred Norman's doing. It's very interesting. Winifred and my mother were very, very dear friends and cousins. And Winifred was always after me to join the Latimer House board in the 1990s. And I always eluded her grasp. I would say, Winnie, I'm on the make professionally. Bernie Watson's working my tail off as head of the National Urban League. I really can't do this right now. And then I retired, and Rand hunted me down a couple of years ago and said, "You don't have any excuses anymore." I said, "You're right." So I joined the board a couple of years ago, and it's really, if ever there's a labor of love, this is it. I feel like I'm giving back to Winnie and to my Aunt Louise, and above all to Lewis Latimer.
Have you challenged PBS and other media companies who ignore Latimer's contributions to Edison's work?
Well, we're doing more than challenging. We're working with a producer who has actually proposed creating a documentary series. And I recently, and we're hoping that PBS will fund it. I recently, having worked in the industry, wrote a letter to the president. I wrote a letter out of the blue to the president and to the chief programming officer at PBS to introduce them to the documentary, tell them a little about Lewis Latimer, tell them about how I worked in public television and PBS hadn't done right. And I asked them to take a look at the proposal. And I'm happy to say that they responded in 3 days, and they are looking at it. That plus a token won't get me on the subway in New York, but I hope that they will respond favorably. But they have a specific proposal by this filmmaker who wants to do, I think it's 4 hours combination on George's case and on Lewis Latimer. So we're working that.
Great. Several bravos, excellent, fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
And also for me, it was excellent. Thank you very much.
Well, it's easy to talk about him. His life was, the more I learned about him, I was not kidding when I say that I'm gonna be crude. I figured these old ancestors, they're dead, not going anywhere, but I had someplace to go. So I was going to play sports or go track down my girlfriend. But the revelations and absorbing their stories and the significance of their stories, and in many respects, the stories get ever more relevant. When you look at the attacks that are being waged against school systems now, where teachers want to teach Black history, and you look at what the white supremacists are saying about only they built America. I mean, you all live in the middle of this space, so it's more urgent than ever that we tell these stories.
Yes. And ASALH members in the chat, Ranyan, Jan, reach out to education@lewislatimerhouse.org. And we can also be reached at ran.yan@lewislatimerhouse.org to discuss collaborations. Agreed, his story is so incredible and multidimensional. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you on behalf of the organization. Every member has enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. My honor. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the meeting. And
Thank you.
hope we can talk. If you all have any ideas about how to get the national organization thinking about this and what we can do to work with them, we're all ears.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
David?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're both welcome to join us if you'd like to stay, but thank you again, and we will be in touch.
Okay, great.
Excellent.